Okay, let's dive in. Today we're unpacking a set of sources that really paint a compelling picture of the international order right now.
Hmm.
Specifically, where the major powers seem to be hitting some real challenges.
And at the same time, how smaller players are finding ways to, well, push back.
Exactly. We've got material covering everything from like geopolitical flashpoints to economic trends, even some deep dives into military history.
That's right. And our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is really to pull out the key insights from all this.
Yeah.
We want to try and understand what's actually going on underneath the surface when the established system feels like it's, under strain. What are these challenges really about?
It feels like such a critical moment to be grappling with these things.
Mm.
And to do that, we're actually going to start really small, like super specific place.
Okay.
And then we'll zoom out, look at the broader patterns, the global shifts these sources are pointing to. It's quite a journey we've mapped out here.
And understanding how those levels connect, the frontline experience versus the grand strategy that's really crucial for making sense of the world today, isn't it?
Absolutely. Okay, so starting point. We're heading to this tiny island in the South China Sea. It's called Tagasa.
Controlled by the Philippines.
Right. And one source describes it as, like, barely big enough to live on. Just 37 hectares.
Which is tiny. But here's the thing, about 300 civilians live there.
Yeah. That's what makes it so unusual in this, heavily disputed area.
They've got small wooden houses, they fish, grow vegetables. Sounds almost idyllic in a way.
It does. But then you get the contrast.
Yeah.
The same source mentions approaching the island and counting, get this, at least 20 Chinese ships just parked offshore.
Wow. 20.
Navy ships, Coast Guard, and these sort of maritime militia boats.
Yeah.
Basically fishing vessels being used to assert presence. That image, it really sticks with you.
It does. And that constant presence, it's not just random. It's part of China's whole strategy in the South China Sea for the last decade or so.
Expanding their footprint.
Exactly. Building air bases on what were submerged reefs, deploying, hundreds of ships to back up their claims to these really vital sea lanes.
But Pegasa, it's different, isn't it? It's actual solid land, not reclaimed stuff.
That's key. It strengthens the Philippines' legal position. Plus, the civilian population.
Right. And legally, its size gives it its own 12 nautical mile territorial sea. The source calls it a linchpin for the Philippines out there.
And you see that pressure reflected in daily life. Getting supplies in from Palawan, the main Philippine island, is tough.
A long boat trip or a plane if the weather's right.
Yeah, 2 or 3 days by boat or an hour by plane, but it's all weather dependent. The report mentions seeing a C-130 transport absolutely crammed floor to ceiling.
With everything, mattresses, eggs, rice.
Motorbikes, people, just
It's-
everything needed to keep that community afloat.
It really highlights the isolation. They have made some upgrades, though. Surfaced the runway, I think.
Yeah, lengthen the runway, new hangar, control tower, dredge the harbor a bit. But the basic challenge, getting things in and out, that remains.
And that challenge hits people directly,
Mm.
especially fishing. That's got to be crucial for them.
Absolutely. The report features a fisherman, Larry Hugo. He filmed himself being nearly rammed by a Chinese Coast Guard ship back in 2021.
Wow.
And now he has to fish much closer to shore, where the stocks are lower, because the bigger Chinese ships just chase him off the better grounds further out.
That's geopolitics hitting someone's dinner table right there.
Yeah.
You hear these contrasts from the residents, too.
Mm-hmm.
A teacher calls it paradise, peaceful despite everything. But then a health worker highlights how hard it is to evacuate someone seriously ill if a plane can't land.
Exactly. It's got this, sleepy charm the source mentions, but underneath it feels like a garrison, a civilian community holding the line.
Yeah, and there's this routine tension. The Chinese have an airbase nearby on Subi Reef,
Just 32 kilometers away.
and they apparently challenge every single Philippine plane that approaches Pagasa.
And the Filipino pilots just respond, "This is Philippines territory." Every single time.
So the government is pushing back more now, sending diplomatic protests.
Weekly formal protests,
Yeah.
yeah. About the ships in Pagasa's waters, it's a shift from the previous administration, which reportedly tried to avoid confrontation, hoping for Chinese investment.
So this tiny island is really on the sharp end of a massive global power struggle.
It absolutely is. And what's fascinating about Pagasa, I think, is how it captures this much broader theme we see in the sources.
Which is?
That powerful nations, well, they don't always win, especially against smaller, determined adversaries.
Right. That's a huge takeaway. You'd think, overwhelming military force equals guaranteed victory. But the sources talk about asymmetric conflict, and it often doesn't play out that way.
And the research digs into why. For the big external power, the war is usually limited. Their actual survival isn't threatened. So it
Okay.
doesn't automatically trump, say, domestic spending or other priorities. It eats up resources, money, lives, political will that could be used elsewhere.
And if it drags on without a clear win,
Support at home starts to fray, divisions emerge, and that can push towards withdrawal.
whereas for the smaller group, the insurgents or the nation being invaded.
It is survival, it's existential. And that threat creates incredible cohesion, a willingness to bear immense costs.
Those motivations are just fundamentally different, worlds apart.
And we see this pattern repeating in history, right? The sources point to several U.S. military conflicts, often seen as, well, maybe not outright defeats, but certainly where the original goals weren't met.
Vietnam comes to mind immediately.
Classic example, U.S. supporting South Vietnam becomes this huge Cold War proxy fight. Immensely unpopular back home, protests, resource drain.
And the U.S. pulls out in 73, North Vietnam wins in 75. Those images from the Saigon evacuation,
Humiliating, yeah. Or Afghanistan more recently.
post 9/11 invasion, aiming to get al-Qaeda dismantled the Taliban.
And they did initially, but the Taliban regrouped over 2 decades. Huge investment of resources.
Billions, trillions even.
And then the withdrawal in 2021, and the Taliban just swept back into power. Again, those chaotic evacuation scenes.
And Iraq after 2003. Similar story in some ways.
Struggled to stabilize the country after the invasion, signed an agreement, left. But the instability helped ISIS rise, which pulled the U.S. back in indirectly.
There are other examples too, aren't there? The Bay of Pigs invasion in 61 is mentioned.
Yeah, a quick, disastrous failure. CIA-backed exiles try to overthrow Castro, fails in days. Huge embarrassment, and it actually solidified Castro's position.
The sources even mention older ones, like a war with Algiers where the U.S. paid tribute, and something in Formosa.
Right, the Formosa expedition retreated after the commander was killed by local guerrillas, and Korea ended in a stalemate, back to the original dividing line. One source really hammered home these recurring themes.
Like what?
Inability to lock down a win after intervening, propping up local governments that turn out to be fragile or unreliable. Think South Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Okay, yeah.
Failing to win over the population, despite promises of stability or democracy, and crucially, the difficulty for the U.S. political system to sustain domestic support for these long, costly wars.
The human cost, the financial cost, the anti-war sentiment, it all adds up.
And political leaders often want quick wins, while military commanders might say withdrawal needs to be based on conditions on the ground, creating friction.
And it's not just a U.S. problem, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
That's a direct challenge to the U.S.-led order, sure. But the U.S. response, like sending aid to Ukraine, has also strained American military resources and, exposed some cracks within NATO, too.
Disputes over how much support to give, European worries about escalation.
Exactly. And calls from places like France and Germany for more strategic autonomy, less dependence on the U.S. So yeah, great powers hitting these strategic bumps. It's a broader phenomenon.
Okay, so it's not just about military setbacks. The sources also talk about other kinds of challenges to the established order.
Definitely. A big one is how rising powers, particularly China, are using their economic muscle.
Right, the Council on Foreign Relations source really focuses on this. China's increasing willingness to sort of bend or break international norms using economic pressure.
Economic coercion, yeah. Against countries it sees as threatening its core interests.
And those interests are pretty broad. Isolating Taiwan.
Securing resources, stopping criticism of the Communist Party, pushing back against security alliances like those with the U.S., projecting a certain image.
And the way China does this coercion, it's tricky. The source says it's often informal.
That's a key point. Not usually official sanctions or tariffs that are easy to point to. It's more subtle, gives Beijing flexibility, makes it harder to prove or rally a response against.
And they're not just targeting small countries anymore.
No, they've taken on bigger players like Australia, South Korea, and the Lithuania case from 2021 is really stark.
What happened there?
Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a representative office using the name Taiwan. Beijing reacted very strongly. Stranded Lithuanian goods at Chinese ports pressured multinational companies with supply chains in Lithuania to cut ties. Lithuanian exports to China just plummeted, like 80% drop.
Wow. And did other countries help Lithuania?
There was some help. The U.S. Export-Import Bank offered credit. The EU started a WTO case, developed an anti-coercion tool. But the source suggests the response was kind of fragmented.
Not really a unified strategy.
Exactly. No clear, coordinated plan among U.S. allies. Often, the targeted country is left to figure things out mostly on their own. Lithuania did find other markets eventually, reducing its dependence.
But it shows the challenge, doesn't it? There aren't strong established ways for allies to band together against this kind of economic pressure, even if they talk about it.
Right, U.S. actions were separate from EU actions in that case. The sources float ideas like formal agreements between allies to help targeted states open markets, give aid, work together at the WTO, or maybe U.S. laws to make assisting easier.
And China's reaction to things like U.S. tariffs, they're not just rolling over, are they?
Not at all. That BBC report from the EU market was fascinating. These toy sellers, they were basically shrugging off U.S. tariffs from the Trump era.
Calling them jokes.
Yeah, and actively shifting focus to markets in South America, the Middle East, traders learning Spanish and Arabic.
That shows real adaptation.
And one buyer from Colombia was quoted saying the trade friction created many opportunities for him. He felt business with China was very important, while with the U.S., less so.
That really illustrates the shifting trade dynamics. And we see similar shifts in energy too, right?
Definitely. China and India buying up discounted Russian oil, refining it, then exporting petroleum products. Russia using, like, shadow tankers and obscure trading houses to get around sanctions.
So money and goods are finding new routes outside the traditional Western systems.
Exactly. All these different threads, the pressure on Pagasa, the history of great powers struggling in asymmetric wars, China's economic coercion, these shifting trade flows, they all feed into the main argument of that American hegemony under strain source.
Right, that source kind of ties it all together, arguing that the decline in U.S. dominance isn't just one thing.
No, it's multidimensional. Economic, strategic, its influence on norms, its role in international institutions. It's being challenged across the board.
And the drivers are these big global shifts, balance of power changing.
Rise of competitors, especially China, alliances transforming.
And the specific factors weakening U.S. hegemony, according to that source. Economically, it mentions globalization, spreading opportunities, strengthening the global south, China, India.
Right, potentially altering the economic foundations. Strategically, there's the idea of overreach.
Spending too much political capital and resources on long, messy wars like Afghanistan.
Exactly. Then there's alliance fragmentation.
Allies hedging their bets, losing some trust in U.S. leadership.
Yeah, you see tensions in NATO, allies in Asia deepening ties with Beijing, even while relying on the U.S. for security. It's complex.
But the source also brings in domestic factors within the U.S. itself, which is really interesting.
Critically important. Political polarization and economic inequality. These aren't just domestic issues. They argue it affects America's global standing.
How so?
Well, deep divisions and inequality can lead to gridlock, erode public trust, make effective governance harder. That makes it tougher to enact reforms at home.
And harder to build consensus on foreign policy, to engage consistently in multilateral efforts.
Precisely. Polarization isn't just among elites anymore. It's down to the public level, this real animosity between groups, amplified by partisan media echo chambers. It makes opponents seem like existential threats, paralyzing action.
So internal division weakens the ability to project stable leadership abroad.
And that ties into another point. Losing influence in international institutions.
Like pulling out of the WHO during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's the example given. The U.S. faced criticism for its handling and for blaming the WHO, maybe creating a vacuum.
And competitors stepped in. China with mask diplomacy, Russia and China with vaccine diplomacy.
Right, and China taking on leadership roles in various UN agencies. So all these factors combined.
They weaken the foundations of the traditional liberal international order.
That's the argument. It potentially emboldens authoritarian states and could lead to a more contested, maybe multipolar world, or even one fragmented into competing blocs.
It's not necessarily saying the liberal order is collapsing entirely.
No, more like it's adapting under pressure, being challenged by different visions of how the world should work, different kinds of power being used.
And U.S. leadership going forward really depends on its ability to adapt, cooperate, work multilaterally.
According to the source, yes. But it also warns that the window to kind of reestablish that leadership is closing fast. We're entering a high-intensity period of great power rivalry.
Okay, so let's bring this all back. What does this complex picture mean for you, our listener?
Well, I think understanding these different layers is key. Seeing the connection between that very personal struggle on a small island like Pagasa
And the historical patterns of powerful nations getting stuck in conflicts.
and the strategic use of economic tools.
And even how a country's internal political health impacts its global role.
Understanding those connections gives you a much richer, deeper grasp of the world we're living in right now. It's not simple.
No, it's definitely not. It helps you see how local events are tied to global trends, how history echoes in current challenges, and how different types of power, military, economic, political, are constantly interacting and being contested.
And it shows that challenges to the big players can come from really unexpected places using all sorts of different methods.
It also really highlights why looking at multiple sources is so valuable, doesn't it? Each one gives you a different angle.
Exactly. The ground level human story,
Sure.
the academic analysis of hegemony, the policy focus on coercion.
Yeah.
You need all those perspectives to get the full picture.
It is tangled, but seeing the connections, like you said, makes it a bit clearer.
Hopefully.
Well, we've gone from that remote island outpost right into the thick of global power dynamics and even looked inside the domestic situation of a major power. It really underscores how intertwined all these challenges are.
It certainly does. You can see the pressure points pretty much everywhere you look.
Which leads us with maybe one final thought for you to chew on. Given how closely linked a nation's internal stability seems to be with its ability to act effectively on the world stage, how might a country's success or failure in resolving its own domestic divisions ultimately shape its power and influence in this increasingly contested multipolar world?
That's a big question to ponder.